Now that we know about the different data types and we also know how to define a variable, let's define a few of the data types that we saw. The first variable that we want to define is a byte type variable. So at first we state the type of the variable, we then name the variable, and then we give it some value. Let's say 34. Now remember, byte is an 8-bit integer, so it won't be able to store too large a number. For example, it won't be able to store 340, but it will be able to store a maximum of up to 127. If I try and store 128, it'll give me an error because it's too large. And in the same way, in the negative direction as well, I can store a maximum of up to 127. That's the smallest number that this can store. Anything smaller than that, and it won't be able to store it. So the smallest number that it can store is minus 128. Let's say we want to store minus 12 in our data, in our variable myByte. Great, now we have defined our variable myByte, and that is of byte type. Next, let's define another variable of the type short. Name it myShort, and again, this also has a higher limit and a lower limit of numbers that it can store. The highest number that it can store is 32,767. In the negative direction, the highest it can store is minus 32,768. Anything lower than that, and it'll give me an error. And anything higher than 32,767 would also give me an error. So let's just store something in between. Great. Now let's look at integer data type. Int data type. That'll be my int. Again, this has a higher and a lower limit. The highest limit of the highest number that it can store is 2 to the 31 minus 1, which is a very large number. So let's see. You can see this is a very large number and it won't be able to store it. This is a number that it can handle. So let's just store something in between. Long can store even larger numbers. So let's try and see how large we can go. Well, this is too large a number. This is a number that long can handle. So this was an example that tried to show you how you can define different types of variables with different data types. Let's try and define some decimal. Let's try to store some decimals in some of our variables as well. And for decimals, we use either float or double. Let's say we are defining a double type integer, a double type number, sorry, and the value is 3.2. And it's not going to give me an error. If I say 3, it won't give me an error either, because then Java would just think of it as 3.0. However, for an integer or for short or anything else, if I try to store a decimal number, it'll give me an error. Float is also something that can store decimals. So let's try and define float as well. You see, this is still giving me an error, because whenever you define a variable, which is a float data type, you always have to append f in the end, or else Java would just think that it's a double and not a float. For float, the precision number that you can store is up to 6 or 7 digits. Double is used when you want to store something with a very high precision. Float can only store numbers with precisions of 6 to 7 digits. Now, we can also store characters, And whenever we are storing characters, we want to include them in single quotes. And you see, we are storing the character A in my character. We can also store any other character that we want. However, if we store more than one character, it'll give us an error because char can only store one character at a time in the variable. Booleans can store either true or false. So we did not name our variable here. The name of our variable is myBoolean, and it can store true or it can store false. Anything else and it'll give us an error. We cannot store numbers in it, we cannot store strings in it, we cannot store characters in it. The only thing we can store is either false or true. Strings are non-primitive data types, and we can have strings that are basically texts. Whenever we are defining a variable, which is a string data type, we want to include it in double quotes. So let's say this is the string that we want to store in my variable, myString. And this is how you'll be able to define different types of variables with different data types.